Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Sacha Altay. He's doing his PhD in cognitive science at the Institut Jean Nicod in Paris. He works with Hugo Mercier on the role of epistemic reputation in communication and the cognitive mechanisms underlying information transmission and evaluation. And today we're going to talk mostly about fake news and misinformation in science. So, Sasha, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, great. So, first of all, let's define fake news. So, how would you define it?
Yeah, so the classic definition is fabricated news that mimics news media in form, but not organizational process or intent. So the idea is that it's something that is false, but that wants to look like reputable and true news. That's the
Oh,
classic definition. So it's fabricated news that try to appear as legitimate, but is not.
but is this a widespread phenomenon? I mean, is it that many people on social media, for example, share fake news, or it's only a minority of people that do that?
Yeah. So first, to understand if a lot of people are sharing fake news, we must understand whether people are consuming fake news because people cannot share things that they are not exposed to. So we first need to look at exposition. But in these studies, they don't use the same definition as the one I gave you. They define fake news at the domain level. That is, everything that is from an unreliable source is considered fake news, whether it's fake, biased, or hyper-partisan. So, for example, everything that Breitbart would share would be considered fake. Whether it's true or not, biased or not, whatever, everything that an unreliable source is sharing is considered fake news. So this study defines fake news like that. So it's very broad and it's more generally misinformation. And so to understand if a lot of people are sharing misinformation, we must first look at how often people consume these kind of things. And the best estimate that we have is that people consume around misinformation represents around 0.15% of people's media diet. So when you look at everything that people consume on the internet, for example, it's 0.15%, and it's 1% of the news that they consume. And that's the stats in the US. And in France, a friend of mine did a study, and it's pretty similar. He looked at how long people spend, what French people do on the internet, and basically people spend very few time consuming news from unreliable websites. So very few people actually consume fake news, and when you look at sharing, it's even more skewed. So you have a very small minority of people that are sharing most of the fake news that we see on social media. So basically, it's not a widespread phenomenon.
So at the beginning of your answer, if I'm not mistaken, you alluded to the fact that we have to be careful when we look at the kinds of studies that have been done on fake news, because some of them can be misleading, correct?
Yeah, the thing is that first, most study on fake news, when they are experimental, you expose participants to fake news that they wouldn't necessarily be exposed to if they were just scrolling through their social media feed. And you know, when you're, for example, on Twitter, you don't follow anyone. Like, you don't follow people at random. You try to follow reliable sources. And when someone is sharing unreliable content, you tend to unfollow them. So when you expose people to fake news in experimental settings, it's very different from the ecology and the news that they are exposed to naturally when they are on social media. So in a sense, you break the cocoon in which people are on social media that is mainly restricted to reliable sources. So, but even when researchers do that and break this cocoon, people intuitively are still good at making the difference between true news and fake news. And that's really impressive because they often cannot rely on the source. So even just on the content and based on their intuition, people are quite good at telling whether the news is true or fake, which is kind of impressive.
And when it comes to the very few people who consume and share fake news, do we know why they do that? Because, I mean, it's very easy for us to say that they are simply stupid or something like that, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question because these people are a minority of people, it's difficult to study them with experiments. So we must look at more natural traces that people leave on social media, their digital traces. And when you do that, these people seem to be highly politicized. So it's, for example, people in the US who are strong supporters of Trump's, who will share pro-Trump's fake news. So overall, the general pattern seems to be that these people are very political and very politically motivated to share this news. And yeah, basically that's it. But you have a discrepancy between the results that you find in online experiments, where who doesn't target people really sharing fake news, and the natural traces that you find on Twitter. And on the natural traces, you find that these people are highly politicized. And in experiments, it's less clear.
But it's not the case that these people are irrational, or is it? I'm asking you about that because I know that you're interested, as Hugo Mercier is, in rationality, and sometimes it seems that people exaggerate a little bit how irrational we are, right?
Yeah. One intuitive thing when you're like, oh, why do people share fake news? It could be that because they can't tell truth from falsehoods. So just because people can't detect the fake news. And yeah, as I said, it's not the case. People intuitively, on average, are very good at detecting fake news. But it should also tell us something about fake news. They don't seem to be designed to dupe people and to make them think that they are true. Sometimes they're obviously false. So they could be used for something else. Like we would suggest, for example, signaling your group membership. You know, you share something that is very implausible to burn bridges with the other side. So you're sharing something that Democrats will think is really stupid to show that you are a really good, Republican group member. You know.
Mm-hmm.
But this hypothesis of burning bridges is actually not well supported, and I don't know how confident I am that it's true. Even Hugo wouldn't bet a lot of money on it, probably. So I'm not quite sure about this hypothesis.
So I've already asked you why people share fake news, but why don't they share more fake news? Is there any particular reason for that?
Yeah, one thing that we hypothesize is that people could, like sharing fake news, just like sharing unreliable content, could hurt your reputation. So that's something we looked at, and we reasoned that to benefit from communication, receivers should trust less people sharing fake news. But if the costs of sharing falsehoods were equal to the benefits of sharing truth, people would end up trusting people misleading them half of the time. So we hypothesized that sharing fake news should hurt one's reputation in a way that is hard to fix by sharing true news. And that's what we found in online experiments. We found that the reputational costs of sharing fake news are higher than the reputational benefits of sharing true news. And we also asked participants how much money they would have to be paid to share fake news and true news. And what we found is that participants asked for more money to share fake news than true news. And they also asked for more money when their reputation was on the line. So when we told them that it would be from their personal social media account, participants asked for more money than when it was the sharing was anonymous. So we think that people are aware of these reputational costs, and they intuitively they know that something is wrong when you share fake news on from your personal social media account. And so we reason that's why most people avoid sharing fake news.
Mm-hmm. And is sharing fake news the same thing as believing it? Because it could be the case that even the few people who share fake news don't really believe the content of it.
Yeah. It's really difficult to tell because most studies are like big data study, so you don't really look at qualitatively what's happening in the data. And even when you look qualitatively, you're not sure what's going on in people's mind. Like how do they receive the news? Like what happens in their mind? but we have some data, for example, from the comments that people leave on misinformation posts. And what you see is that people will often express their disapproval or even their surprise. They would say like, oh, wow, that's really surprising. Or they would even debunk it sometimes and be like, wow, well, that's completely false. But often what people would do is also just have fun in the comments and, for example, tag their friends and just discuss about other things. So we know that people will interact with misinformation for many reasons. And for the sharing, we also know that some people share misinformation to have others' advice about the news, to be like, is it true? Like, have you seen this news is really surprising? It's really interesting, but I have no clue whether it's true or not. Like, could you help me out? So we know that people also share news for this reason, but so it's not clear. We don't really know, but we should not equate sharing with believing. That's one thing I know.
Could it be the case that perhaps it does not have really something to do with the news being true or false, but simply people share news to online to share or to signal their belonging to a particular social group, for example?
Yeah, I'm not sure about group membership per se, but just about we know why people use social media such as Facebook. It's basically to reinforce friendships and relations that you already have. So we know that people are driven by these motivations, by these social motivations, and so it's likely that people share news and do these kind of things to reinforce these bonds. Some authors argue that news sharing is a form of gift. So you give someone something that might be relevant, that might be interesting to discuss. And so it's kind of, yeah, sharing news is motivated by social motivations.
Mhm. So, I mean, that's interesting because then that tells us something about the reasons why people use social media like Facebook, and it's not primarily to be exposed and share fake content, but to foster their social relations, right?
Yes, yes. Actually, we did a study with Manon, a friend of mine. There was this study in 2018 showing that Santé Plus Mag, it's a Facebook page on Facebook, and the study showed that this Facebook page generated 5 times more interactions than the 5 established media outlets in France. So basically, it was a Facebook page generating a lot of interactions, and this Facebook page was known to spread misinformation. So in France, you had numerous journalistic articles and more panic about it, saying that, oh my God, it's crazy. People are interacting with misinformation more than Le Monde and Le Figaro. What's going on? And so with Manon, what we did is we looked at this Facebook page and looked at what they published. And basically, they didn't share that much misinformation. And interestingly, misinformation wasn't that popular. People didn't really interact with misinformation. But what they did is that they interacted with fatigue posts, that we call, is basically postal, like digital greeting cards. It's like, I love you, my sister, or I wish you all to have a very pleasant day. It's these kind of things. And people were sharing this like crazy. And in a few hours, you had like thousands of people sharing that. And these things, they have no informational content. It's just about, how are you guys? I wish you the best. And so the goal of this post are really just to show that you love others and to reinforce bonds. And so it's funny because this page that was supposed to share a lot of misinformation was actually popular because it allowed people to reinforce bonds with others. And that's also one weaknesses of the big data analysis is that you don't really know what's going on. And when you look at the data, when you go and do qualitative analysis and this kind of thing, usually it doesn't match what you see from like the big data patterns.
Mhm. I don't know if this question falls outside of your expertise and the general purview of this interview, but uh, There are some people that say that social media, for example, damage social relationships and affect negatively how people interact with one another. But is that really the case? Because if people use social media mostly to foster their social relations, I mean, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question because you have some, it's also easier to compare yourself to others on social media, and so you're more exposed to the most popular people, and you have this paradox that your friends on average have more friends than you are. So you have a lot of these things that reinforce maybe some negative aspects of social relationships, like the comparison with people that are higher, like higher status than you are. But overall, it's not clear whether social media are good or bad. I think it really depends on how people use them, what you do of it. And of course, you can, but it's just like any relationships, you could say, oh, like the question is weird, it's just like, is it good to have like a girlfriend or a boyfriend? Yeah, sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad. It depends on the person, on of what you do of the relationship, of your state of like it depends on so many things. And asking it about social media, it's weird. It's a technology. It depends on how we use it. It depends on so many things that, yeah, I think sometimes researchers are asking weird question that, yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that I read some studies, some of them done in the early days of the internet, and I think that they were replicated where people were looking into, for example, the number of friends people had on their social media and how they compared to their real life relationships. And it seems that people who have more friends on social media tend to be the ones that are more sociable, and so that would translate into real life interactions, let's say. So it doesn't seem to be the case that people who are more active on social media are less active in their real life,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's say.
Yeah, yeah. But even if it was the case, like it's not clear where we should have like normative judgments about whether like real life social interactions are better than online interactions. It's like this thing about video games. Oh, it's bad that people are playing video games, but people have been playing football or any other sports. Like it's the same. But we still have a lot of these normative judgments about new technologies that I think are blinding us. Like it's the same about screen, like art screens making our child stupid. Like we have all these things that in 20 years we are gonna have fun of it. It's you had the same with the radio. It was like, oh, will people be able to tell the truth from falsehood if there is communicated information that comes from a little machine talking to you, like or books. Like, are people going to be able to live in reality? If there is books, maybe they are going to spend their times in books. And you have all these like more panics about new technologies that come up every time there is something new. And yeah, so I think we shouldn't be too worried about it.
Yeah. So going back to fake news, we've already talked about here how very few people are exposed to and consume fake news. But do we know if there's more fake news going around in, for example, new and alternative media in comparison to mainstream media?
Um, that's a problem of the research on fake news is that it's focused on social media primarily, and so we don't know much about how much fake news there is on mainstream media. It's very difficult actually. We know that in the US you have a gray zone between mainstream media sharing very few fake news and the unreliable websites, but between the two you have a gray zone with some in between mainstream media that are giving visibility to fake news that usually are consumed by very few people, but you have these media that are giving visibility and that are setting the agenda. They put forward this fake news, and so people talk about it and see them. So some have argued that most fake news are actually seen on mainstream media and traditional media such as television more so than social media. So actually, we don't know much, but one thing I think most people would agree on is the role of elites. You know, people such as Donald Trump sharing fake news is really bad because he has many followers, and then CNN and the mainstream media will talk about this fake news, and so people will be exposed to fake news this way. And I think that's really, because if it's like Brian with 8 followers sharing fake news on Twitter, it doesn't matter, no one will see it, it will not influence anyone. But if it's the president of the United States, and if the New York Times or these journals on television, if these mainstream media talk about the fake news, I think, yeah, it's damaging.
Mhm. Do we know if fake news has any sort of impact on people's behavior? Or, I mean, just by being exposed to fake news, that doesn't really change much in terms of how people behave?
Yeah. So first, it depends what we mean by behavior. Like, are we talking about like voting intentions? Like, did fake news cause Trump victory or the Brexit? Because this kind of behavior is extremely hard to change. So it's extremely unlikely that fake news affected these big like events. And also, yeah, what I was saying is that it's not clear that every fake news can be translated into a particular behavior. Some of them don't have a clear behavioral transcription. So, for example, if you believe the Earth to be flat, it's not clear how it's going to change how you behave. You're still going to walk, you're still going to do all the things you do on a daily basis, but you're just going to have like these reflexive beliefs about the Earth to be flat. But whether you believe the Earth to be flat, to be a square, or to be a sphere, it doesn't change your behaviors. And among the fake news that can be translated into a particular behavior, to measure whether fake news change people's behaviors, so we need to know how many people consume fake news. And so since very few people consume fake news, and that the people who consume fake news consume like pro-attitudinal fake news, for example, it's the pro-Trump supporters who will consume the pro-Trump fake news, at best it can reinforce their priors and maybe fuel polarization or these kind of things, but it won't change their voting intentions since they are just consuming things that they agree with, and mostly that's what we see with fake news is people are consuming and sharing news that they already agree with. So it's unlikely that it will change their behaviors. And you had this cool study by Kim and Kim. So they conducted a longitudinal study to measure the causal impact of fake news on the fake news that Obama was a Muslim in particular. So they looked at people's behavior and people's beliefs. And so they found that among people who disliked Obama, they were more likely to believe that Obama was a Muslim, but it had no effect on voting intentions. And it's precisely because the effect of the fake news was on people who were predisposed to dislike Obama. So when you dislike Obama, you're gonna like use anything against him, basically. You don't really care about how accurate it is. You just want arguments to justify the fact that you don't like Obama. So you're gonna say, yeah, I believe he's a Muslim. But still, you already made up your mind. You already disliked him and you already didn't want to vote for him. But when you're a Democrat and you like Obama, you won't believe that Obama is a Muslim and it won't change your voting intentions. So yeah, I'd say that, but it's not so much that fake news don't have a weak impact on people's behavior, it's that everything have a weak impact on people's behavior. You have this literature, for example, on the value behavior gap. So even people's value are a weak predictor of their behavior. So even when you say you love the environment, you're still going to travel and take the plane, you're still going to do all these things, So even when you have strong values, it doesn't necessarily translate into behavior. So for fake news to translate into behavior, it needs to be like something really crazy. And that's also an important point, is that even when fake news change people's mind, it doesn't necessarily translate into behavior. And since people are quite good at discerning fake from true news, it's not even clear that they believe in it in the first place. So you need all these steps, you need them to find them plausible, to believe them, and then to translate into behaviors, and to translate into the right behavior. Because yeah, you value the environment, so you're going to recycle. But recycle doesn't matter. What matters is not eating meat and not taking the plane. So it doesn't even translate into necessarily the right behavior. So it's, yeah, human behaviors and human beliefs is so complex that it's unlikely that fake news have a direct impact on people's behavior.
That's very interesting. So, if there's this disconnect between people's beliefs and people's behavior, why is it that they express certain beliefs? I mean, is it that they really believe what they say they believe? Or, I mean, or they believe what they really say they believe and behavior? I mean, it's very hard to understand here, this
Yeah,
disconnect.
yeah. So you have many philosophical take on this issue. I think when, for example, for the why people who are pro environment don't still travel and eat meat and do these kind of things, I think a charitable interpretation is that they don't know what is good and what is bad. So they just have this value and think that they translate it the best way they can into behaviors. But you have also other kind of beliefs, as have argued like Sperber and Mercier, that are reflective. So these kind of beliefs are don't translate literally into behaviors because you can't even really understand them. You know, they are in parentheses in your head. It's like when you're a child and you're being told that cucumbers are made of water, they are still solid, you know. So what do you make of this? You're still going to grab the cucumber, you know, you're not going to drink the cucumber. So these beliefs are reflective in the sense that you're like, oh yeah, the teacher told me that cucumbers are made of water, but it doesn't change anything. And it's the same for the earth to be flat. You know, the earth is flat. Yeah, I believe the earth to be flat, but the other cognitive systems in my head, I'm not going to take this belief into account to translate it into behaviors or even inferences. You know, you're going to draw a few inferences from it maybe, but not about intuitive physics, about the way you walk, about many decisions won't be affected by this belief because it just won't be taken as input by the other cognitive modules. And so these reflective beliefs, some people have argued that their function can be social sometimes. So you can be like, yeah, I strongly believe this, and people do believe it. But it's just that since it's so reflective and doesn't affect people's belief, affect people's behavior, sorry, you can use them to, signal group membership, show that you are moral. You're going to be like, oh yeah, this study is really racist, it's bad, blah, blah. But you don't really care, you don't really believe it. You just want to signal that you are moral. And the same thing, you want to show that you care about the environment, you care about the right causes. And so you can use these beliefs to signal things.
So, I mean, before we move on to other topics, let me just close this issue on misinformation. So, I know you told me that you would like to talk about misinformation on misinformation. So, tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that an interesting point on misinformation, so as we've seen, is that there is this media alarmist headlines about misinformation that we should be scared of. But not only misinformation, it's also about screens, about social media, about everything. So these alarmist narratives, they are very popular. And we think there are reasons why they are popular. For example, we love threat-related information. We know, like from the studies in cultural evolution and in evolutionary psychology, that threat-related information, like we love it. We have an appetite for threat-related information. And this kind of narratives fall very well into this category. And we also have, a general negative bias towards new technologies. Every time there is a new technologies, we are very skeptical, and we always like think the worst of it, like what could work, what is worse that could happen with this technology. And we also have a preference for simple explanations. We love monocausal explanations, especially, for example, there is a third-person effect of fake news. So you believe others are more influenced by fake news than you are. So we overestimate others' gullibility. So it's very attractive, for example, when you're a Democrat and Trump win the 2016 presidential election, to be like, how could people vote for him? Like, they must be stupid, they must have been brainwashed, there must be a reason. And you're like, oh, fake news. Yeah, they must have been brainwashed by fake news, and that explains why they did this. But if they had been well informed, they wouldn't have done that. So you have this simple explanation, which is that Republicans voted for Trump because they have been manipulated by fake news. And it's exacerbated by this third-person effect, because not only you believe others to be more influenced, but you believe the out-group to be more influenced than your in-group. So basically, when you're a Democrat, you believe Republican to be more influenced by fake news than Democrats. So all these narratives, I think they are very appealing to the human mind, but they can also be damaging because we know that when people think that there is a lot of misinformation in their environment, they have a lower trust, so they trust others and the media less. They have narrower media diets, so basically they consume news from a more restricted number of sources, and they have a lower willingness to share news in general on social media. And it is a problem because people don't really consume news. Most people don't care about the news, and they don't care about politics too. So if people have lower trust and are unwilling to share news, like it's really like a problem for the whole democratic process, you know. And so, yeah, I'm arguing in papers I'm writing that this whole narrative about misinformation can actually reinforce the problem, the core problem of misinformation, which is that people don't trust mainstream media, they don't trust reliable news, and that they don't consume news from these outlets. And so by saying that there are a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake news, people are going to trust them even less, and that's going to reinforce the problem.
So would you say that there's a moral panic about fake news?
Yeah. I'm not the first one to argue that. People in media studies, yeah, have argued that for years now, and I think it can be applied here to misinformation more broadly. There is really media panics, and more panics, and it's fueled by the media also, by traditional media, who are like, yeah, you should not trust social media. You should come consume news with us, not on social media. Social media are not reliable. And you have the same thing with elites who are instrumentalizing misinformation, with Trump saying you should not trust mainstream media. Mainstream media are sharing fake news. So when they say that I'm lying and things like that, don't believe them, you know. So that he is not held accountable. And so all this fake news discussion is instrumentalized by many actors, by mainstream media, by elites, by many people. So it's a very complicated mess.
Yeah. So, are there aspects of how people interact online that can be better understood by applying cultural evolutionary theory?
Yeah, I think cultural evolutionary theory is powerful with its focus on content, like what type of content will people find most attractive, what content will people remember better, what content will people find more plausible. But I think that cultural evolution theory has largely focused on the receiver standpoint, like how people receive information, how they will reinterpret the information that we tell them, and all this kind of process that happens when you receive communicated information. But it didn't focus enough, I think, on the sender's standpoint. So what do you do when you have information? What information do you decide to share? And in what circumstances? And in what context? And with whom? So you have all these factors that are what we call goal-based factors. It's like, what are your goals? What do you want to do with the information? What impression do you want to convey to others? And I think this is something that cultural evolution needs to integrate to be kind of complete, because right now it's not clear to me how good the existing explanation explain, for example, the success of content on the internet, because it doesn't take into account that, yeah, people sometimes will be politically motivated. So they won't really care about the content. What will matter is just whether it is politically aligned or not. So yeah, I really like cultural evolution theory, but I think it needs to be like to integrate more dimensions into its theoretical framework.
So now talking about specifically about misinformation on science,
Yeah.
what are some of the cognitive bases that would be important for people to understand, to understand a little bit better how people fall for misinformation on scientific matters?
Yeah. So I think the most obvious one is relevance. You know, we want to maximize the informativeness of the information we receive. And sometimes by doing so, we reinterpret information based on our priors. And this can tweak a little the information. For example, if you overestimate the risk of like nuclear power, and I tell you that nuclear power is dangerous, you're going to reinterpret it and maybe overestimate a little. And so when you do transmission chain experiments, for example, and you have only people who are scared of nuclear power, at the end of the chain, people are going to think that it is completely terrible because people will have reinterpreted the information based on their priors. And so you will have a crazy increase of like the danger of the real information. It's Mehdi Moussaid who did a co-paper on that in PNAS. So you have this, when you receive information, you reinterpret it based on your priors and to maximize relevance. And it also happens when you share information, you want to maximize relevance for the people that will receive the information. And by doing so, you will also tweak a little the information because, people's mental representation are not the same as the public representation. And in this transfer between private and public representation, you have some changes that happen. And what they maximize is not accuracy. Accuracy is important, but what they want to maximize is informativeness, how informative it is. So just in this transfer, there will be some modifications. And people will also, of course, use scientific evidence to justify pre-existing belief and show that they belong to the right tribe. And this is especially prevalent, for example, in countries where you have high affective polarization, such as the US. So it's affective polarization. It's how much you feel about the other group. It's not really what you think and what your beliefs are. It's how much you dislike or like the other group. And so, for instance, in the US, you had this, for example, Democrats wearing masks as a sign of group belonging. And they keep wearing masks outside, even though it's not necessary anymore, just to show that you belong to the right group. And on the other side, you have Republicans who oppose wearing masks. And so it becomes this whole political thing, even though it should just be a scientific matter. But people use science to fulfill all kind of goals. And one of it is showing that you belong to the right tribe and show your group membership.
Mm-hmm. So, online, even when people share scientifically rigorous pieces of news, it doesn't mean necessarily that they understand the science behind it. It could simply be a sort of group signaling.
Yeah. It could be, but by sharing science news, you can also show that you are competent and you know that you are someone smart in the known. So people also use that to signal these kind of things. And to signal that you don't really need to read the article or whatever, you can just share it and be like, oh, look, like it's really interesting, and boom, you appear competent. And people will also share things that are like happy and nice to show that they are warm, such as like the fatigue post that we talked about, just like, oh, I love you, my sister, I wish you a whole happy day. It's just something nice that you share because you want to appear nice.
Mm-hmm. So we've already mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic several times here in this interview. Is there lots of misinformation surrounding COVID that has been spread in online settings?
You had this whole thing about the infodemic, and it was this more panic, let's say, again, and it was the WHO, the World Health Organization, so it was reputable, and everyone is citing that in their articles. But who they are to say that there is an infodemic? Like, when you look at what changes in people's behavior regarding news, what happens is that people consume more reliable news, not more unreliable news. So you had this, for example, in the US, you had this increase between 4 billion visits per year to reliable news to 6 billion. And for unreliable news, it's something like 134 millions visit to unreliable news to 180 millions. So you had like something like 50 more millions visit to unreliable websites, but you had 2 billion visit more to reliable websites. So there is no infodemic in the sense that there is misinformation everywhere. There is information everywhere, but it's not. And another side of the infodemic is that people are lost because there's too much information. It's not clear. People avoided the news during the pandemic sometimes because it was too negative and too repetitive. But it's not clear that they were really lost, like in a jungle of information. Like some people just had time and just wanted to consume a lot of information because they wanted to be well informed. And most people are extremely well informed during the pandemic. And misinformation isn't that strong, I think. Some studies, for example, have shown that during the pandemic, it's more that people are uninformed on some topics than misinformed. So sometimes there are some things that people don't know, but it's unlikely that people are completely mistaken on something. So this whole thing about the infodemic is another moral panic, I think.
Yeah. What about vaccine hesitancy specifically? Are there high levels of that among people?
Yeah, so I did a study myself with colleagues, and we it was really scary because at the end of 2020 in France, for example, you had only 23% of the population who was willing to get vaccinated. 23%. It was like it really slow, really low. So we were really scared. But actually, with time, vaccine hesitancy largely reduced. And right now, people, they don't want the AstraZeneca vaccines, but everyone wants the Pfizer vaccine. People don't want the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson either. I don't know why. But people really like the Pfizer vaccine, and they don't want the AstraZeneca because of the blood clots and all these things. People are really scared about it. But everyone wants the Pfizer vaccine. And right now in France, the problem is that we don't have enough doses rather than vaccine hesitancy. So for right now, the problem is doses rather than vaccine hesitancy. But the problem of vaccine hesitancy could come later when we need, for example, 80% of the population to be vaccinated. Maybe at this stage, we will need to fight vaccine hesitancy. But right now, it's not clear that even in the US, vaccine hesitancy isn't a big problem. And what's interesting is that you have more than 80% of Americans over 65 that got at least one shot of the vaccine. And among these people, you have a lot of Republicans and Fox News viewers. And these people, they have been exposed to misinformation. Like Fox News has spread this misinformation on the COVID, on the vaccines. Like they have actively spread misinformation. But despite all this misinformation, these old people, they got vaccinated, even though they consume conservative media. And that's interesting. You had this thread on Twitter by Henri Farrell saying that, when an advice might kill you, you're not going to follow it, That people will be vigilant when it matters. And that's what happens, and it's based on the intuitive reflexive thing by Hugo, is that you can have all sorts of crazy beliefs that are reflexive and say, all these things are crazy, we should not wear masks, we should not do that, blah, blah. But then when it matters, and if your life is at stake, it won't affect your behavior, and you will get vaccinated. So I think that's a really clear case of the distinction between intuitive and reflexive beliefs. When it matters, you don't care about misinformation, you don't care about bad advice, even by sources that you trust. You will do the right thing.
That's very interesting. So there seems to be this common thread here where, we always have to look at social factors behind people's behavior and what they say, and not simply saying that, for example, people who express anti-vaxxer positions online, that they are simply stupid or that they will not take the vaccine and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and in France, many people who said that they didn't want to get vaccinated, now they are getting vaccinated, But it's also because now people want to go to restaurants and they want to do all these kind of things. So they're also just like, okay, let's go. I'm going to get vaccinated.
And do we know if there would be, for, let's say, the minority of people who are really hardcore anti-vaxxers, do we know if there would be any way of framing the message to them that they would listen to it and perhaps reconsider their behavior?
So the real anti-vaxxers, I don't think it's possible. These people are really hard to convince, and there is this consensus in the literature that we should not focus on anti-vaxxers, but instead on fence-sitters, people who are in between, who are vaccine hesitant, They are not really willing to get vaccinated, but they don't have a strong opinion. They are just scared of vaccines, and they get vaccinated because it's compulsory. But when it's not compulsory anymore, they don't get vaccinated, and they want to delay the schedule of vaccine, etc. So these people are the target of communication campaigns, and they represent nearly the majority of the population because hardcore anti-vaxxers are like 5% of the population everywhere, in every country of the world. You have 5% of the population who don't want to get vaccinated and who have really strong hardcore anti-vax. But usually the rest of the population is either in favor of vaccination or in between. So the literature have said that we should focus on the people who are in between. And with Hugo, recently we argued that we should also focus on people who are pro-vaxxers, because even the pro-vaxxers, when you look at the arguments that they have to convince others, they are rather weak and they don't have many arguments. What seems to be more the case is just like with conspiracy theories, you know. You cannot argue with someone who will tell you that 911 is an inside job. You won't have the argument. You will lose. Like they will destroy you because they know everything. They know all the arguments. They have all these arguments. You cannot argue with them. And it's kind of the same with anti-vaxxers. They know so many things. They have learned so many arguments. They are false, but still they know many arguments that you can't debunk. So what we wanted to do with Hugo is say that maybe we should focus on pro-vaxxers so that they can argue against anti-vaxxers, and more simply convince the ones that are hesitant. Because we know that interpersonal communication, when you talk with an expert or with friends and people you trust, is a very fertile ground for attitude change. So people change their mind when they discuss with others. So if we give arguments to people who are in favor of vaccination, maybe they can then later convince others that vaccination is good.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in general, I hope I'm not saying anything wrong here, but it seems that even if it's only a minority of people that have been exposed to misinformation and that had particularly negative health-related behaviors when it comes to the coronavirus, there were still some issues that we had in terms of how governments and health agencies communicated information, because it didn't seem to be the best way of doing so, and there were still, for example, in certain countries, demonstrations against masks and against the lockdowns and stuff like that. So do we know if there would have been any better way for governments and health authorities to communicate information regarding coronavirus that perhaps would lead to more compliance on the part of people?
Yeah, I think government did a bad job overall. And mostly it's because I think they didn't rely on data from like psychology and behavioral sciences. So one of the things that, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm mostly saying what Michael Bain-Peterson would say, I think, is that one of the things that government did and shouldn't have done is think that people are stupid and be like, oh yeah, we can lie to them and tell them that, for example, masks are not useful because we don't have masks, you know. So we tell them, no, you don't need to wear masks. It's okay. And then when we have masks, we tell them, yeah, no, we should wear masks. So no, you shouldn't do that. You should not lie to people, because if you erode trust in government, it's over. You know, people are already very skeptical of the government. So if you lie and say, in France we used to say, masks are, you don't need to wear masks, and so we are scared that people will panic because if we tell them that there is no mask, but it's not the case, you know. The thing about panic is also moral panic. We think that when you tell the truth to people, they will go crazy and they will do all kind of irrational behaviors, but it never happens. Panic is a myth. Panic doesn't exist. So we should tell the truth to people. We should think that they are people that are smart, and we can tell them the truth and they can take it. So I think that's maybe the main thing, is that, we should not infantilize the lay people. Like, lay people are smart and they can take, we can tell them, we have no mask, but we are going to buy many, we made mistakes. And the government never does that. Like, the government in France in particular, I'm not an expert of other countries, but did a bad job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just one last question. In general, do we have any strategies coming from cultural evolutionary theory that would help us fight back against scientific misinformation and illiteracy?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there is no panacea, like a thing that would solve it all, but maybe you have some small things that could help, such as making scientific information more intuitive. So you could use, for example, it has been argued that you can use narratives instead of like boring stories. You can make them a little like, you can frame them in narratives. And you can also try to frame numbers in a way that is intuitive to people so that they won't misunderstand it. And all you need to do that is just pre-test the messages that you're going to use, basically. Is just give it to people and see whether they misinterpret it and how basically they interpret it. So this is more for like communication campaigns. But for scientists in particular, I think it's also important to know your audience and anticipate the point that they are likely to misinterpret. So, for example, now some papers in science, they come with frequently asked questions that tackle all the potential misunderstandings. So, for example, oh, there are sex differences between men and women, but it doesn't mean that it's good, and it doesn't mean that it ought to be, and blah, 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 and these differences are small. So you can answer people's concern. And I think also scientists should do more to engage with their audience. So basically, as scientists, we should not be like in our ivory tower and on a pedestal. We should talk with people so that they think that we have good intentions toward them. Because we know that people already think that we are competent as scientists, but they are not quite sure about whether we have their best interest at heart. Because usually when you see them, the scientists, you imagine like the doctor, very cold and very competent, but very cold. So you're quite not sure about whether you can trust him like fully or her. But you have the image, of course, of a white dude with a with a white thing. So yeah, so it's someone who is smart but who is not nice. So we should break completely, I think, this stereotype. And yeah, scientists should interact with people so they see that we are nice, that we have a lot of women around us, that we have people of color, etc. So I think we should do a better job at interacting with our audience, which is like people, they pay us, So we should, I think we owe them that.
And just the simple fact that people sometimes don't trust on scientists and science in general, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are irrational. Right?
Yeah. Some science in France, you had, for example, Didier Raoult, who was like he's a reputable scientist in the sense that he has many citations and he's very famous. But he had bullshitted like for the whole pandemic. He was saying nonsense on mainstream media for months about hydroxychloroquine. And at first, he's the stereotypical scientist. He seems to be very competent. He's a doctor, etc. And so people had reasons to trust him. But actually, he was just sharing and spreading a lot of misinformation. So people would have been advised to not trust him. So yeah, people's skepticism is, in a sense, justified, even toward the government, when the government is lying and doing things like that. Yeah, it's hard to blame people. I'm more willing to blame scientists and mainstream media and elites than people.
Yeah, and that kind of attitude that certain scientists and science communicators have, that the only thing they have to do is to expose people to the correct information, and then if people don't believe it, it's simply because they're stupid or they're uninformed. Is that helpful in any way?
You're mentioning the deficit model of science communication. It has been highly criticized. But actually, I think that often people just have not been exposed to the correct information. So, for example, when you take nuclear power plants or GMOs, in France, you have a lot of misinformation on mainstream media saying that, nuclear power plants are extremely dangerous, we should be very careful, that GMOs, we are not sure what they do. And this is all bullshit, Nuclear power plants is the future, like GMOs is not dangerous for human health, and there is scientific consensus on that. And the media don't talk about it. And I did research. So when you expose people to these truths, they buy it. They are like, oh, right. Well, I didn't know that there were many studies on that nuclear power plants are actually very effective and not that dangerous, blah, blah, blah. So I think sometimes it's the media that are doing a bad job at, and even like teachers, when you teach science, you teach like the theory of evolution that is like 200 years old. You're not talking about how science really works and like real science advances. So when you had the whole COVID pandemic, people were like, oh, but sometimes scientific results are conflicting. Sometimes scientists don't agree with each other. And you're like, yeah, that's exactly what science is. Science is messy. Science is not the theory of evolution, So I think, it's teachers, scientists, the media, we all need to be a better job at like interacting and communicating with people.
Mm-hmm. So just one final question, and because people have been talking about this a lot recently, does fact-checking work?
Yeah, it works pretty well. It works, but in the wild, will fact-checking find the right audience? So people who are misinformed, And unfortunately, it's less clear. And I think that the best evidence show that not really. Like people who are exposed to fact checking are not necessarily the one who are exposed to the misinformation, and people who are exposed to misinformation are not necessarily exposed to fact checking. So it's not clear that it's a good solution, fact checking. I think there should be fact checking, and for example, on television, it's a different thing. When you have live fact checking of politician debates, I think it's extremely good because you know that people who saw the misinformation will also see the fact checking, and I think that politicians should be held accountable for what they say on mainstream media. And you should have scientists and experts that fact check everything that is said on social media, especially when you know there will be a big audience, or even when scientists talk, or Didier Raoult or things like that. You should not have like one scientist against another. You should just have a bunch of scientists fact checking everything that is said. And if something is false, you just have a big red thing saying that, oh no, actually it's not true. So fact checking on live fact checking on television, I think is great. But on social media, yeah, it's not clear that it will be a good solution, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
I'm very active on Twitter, and you can find all my work on my website. I put all the PDFs on Google Drive, so you can access all my articles. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I talk about most of the thing I work on, and I'm very active.
Okay, I will be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview and also your Twitter handle. So, Sacha, well, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
You're welcome. It was great. Thanks, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing the channel for more than 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you that it's been running for so long. And so, if you like what I'm doing, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview, and to consider making a pledge there, support the show. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollissey, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Horowitz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal. My producers is Web, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardos France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.